The rain poured in sheets, soaking through the delicate fabric of Catherine Ashford's gown as she walked alone through the darkness. The night was oppressive, the weight of her ruined reputation pressing down on her shoulders. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing against the damp cobblestones. The sharp scent of wet earth mixed with the cold sting of the wind. She was alone, utterly alone, cast out of society like a shadow. Her family had turned away from her, and now the world would follow suit. Then, like an apparition, a carriage appeared, gliding silently through the night. Black lacquer gleamed against the silver glow of the rain, and the horses, strong and proud, moved with practiced ease. Catherine barely had time to glance at the ducal crest emblazoned on the door before it swung open. A voice, low and commanding, broke through the storm. "Get in." She hesitated. Something deep within her screamed to turn away, to keep walking, to hold on to the tiny sliver of dignity she had left. But the wind was biting, and her gown clung to her like a second skin, chilled and wet. The voice called again, this time sharper, more insistent. "Get in. You'll die of cold before morning." Catherine looked up. Her heart skipped at the sight of the man standing there, tall with dark, intense eyes that pierced through the rain. His features were strong, almost harsh, but there was something about him that promised safety, warmth, something that felt like a lifeline in the storm. She was ruined, and yet for a moment, standing there in the rain, something within her stirred, an inkling of hope, however foolish it might be. She stepped toward the carriage, knowing it might be the only chance she had to survive the night. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the darkness swallowed her whole. 6 hours earlier, Lady Catherine Ashford stood before the full-length mirror, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. Tonight was supposed to be the night of her triumph, the night she would announce her engagement to Lord Philip Hartley, the Viscount's daughter, betrothed to a baron. Her future was secure, but as she gazed at her reflection, her mind was anything but at ease. Her gown, a soft blush pink with delicate lace and satin, was a picture of modest elegance, and yet it felt like a costume, a mask she was forced to wear. Her mother's excitement fluttered around her, oblivious to the tension that clung to Catherine's chest. "Catherine, darling, how stunning you look. I'm sure Philip will be so proud to call you his fiancée," her mother cooed, adjusting a strand of Catherine's hair. Catherine forced a smile, but inside, her heart twisted. The 3-month engagement had started with such promise, an alliance between two respectable families, a marriage that would secure her future and elevate her status. But now, as the evening drew nearer, something felt wrong. Philip was distant. He'd been distant for weeks, and tonight it was almost unbearable. As they arrived at the grand ballroom, the sound of music and laughter filled the air. The chandeliers overhead cast a golden glow on the hundreds of guests. Catherine's nerves were barely contained beneath the calm exterior, but she had no choice but to join the festivities. The ball was in full swing, with guests laughing and exchanging pleasantries. But as Catherine entered, she felt it, the shift in the atmosphere. Whispers seemed to follow her wherever she went, soft murmurs that she couldn't quite catch, but they lingered like smoke in the air. Her friends, one so eager to congratulate her, looked away. Some avoided her gaze altogether, as if she might somehow taint them with the scandal she was already suspected of. Philip was nowhere to be seen. She found herself alone in a corner, fidgeting with her glass of punch, her eyes scanning the crowd. Miss Vivian Blackwood, her wealthier, more beautiful rival, stood at the far end of the room, her eyes flickering over Catherine with an expression that could only be described as satisfaction. The older woman's gaze lingered a moment too long before she turned away, whispering something to a gentleman beside her. Catherine's stomach churned. Vivian had always been too perfect for her tastes, too sure of her place in society, and now, as Catherine watched her, she could feel the cruel twist of fate. Vivian, with her wealth and connections, was everything Catherine was supposed to be, and tonight she was watching her with a gleam in her eye. Her father, Lord Ashford, caught her gaze from across the room. His face was tense, the worry lines etched deep into his brow. He hadn't spoken much to her lately, but the weight of his disappointment was clear in his eyes. Catherine's heart sank. "Lady Catherine," someone said, breaking her reverie. It was one of her former friends, a woman who once shared secrets and laughter with her. Now, the woman's expression was cool, distant. Her eyes flickered briefly to the doorway before she turned and walked away. Catherine's chest tightened, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The whispers, the cold glances. It was as though the entire room had already passed judgment on her. And then she saw him, Lord Philip Hartley, standing at the musician's platform, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. When he met her eyes, there was no warmth, no affection, only something colder, something almost triumphant. The smile on his face made her blood run cold. It was a smile that said everything she needed to know. And then he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, his voice ringing out clearly over the music, "I have an important announcement to make." Catherine's heart stopped. Something was wrong. She knew it, but she couldn't quite place what. Philip turned toward her, his eyes gleaming, and Catherine's stomach twisted with dread. "I must, with great regret," he continued, "call off my engagement to Lady Catherine Ashford." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to her. She could feel the weight of their gazes, heavy and judgmental. Her mouth went dry. Her hands shook, but her body was frozen. The next words that followed would change everything. When Lord Hartley called for silence and stepped onto the musician's platform, Catherine's blood turned cold. The smile on his face wasn't joy. It was triumph. Catherine's blood ran cold as Lord Philip Hartley stood before the crowd, his eyes gleaming with a cold, calculating triumph. He had just declared his painful duty to break their engagement, and as he revealed the supposed reason, Catherine's world shattered. He accused her of secret correspondence with another man, Mr. James Worthing, an artist, an absurd claim, but the way he presented it made it sound as though the evidence was irrefutable. Philip, with a well-practiced ease, presented forged letters, intimate and damning in nature. The murmurs rippled through the crowd as gasps of disbelief turned into harsh whispers. The entire ballroom, once a place of celebration, now felt like an arena of judgment. The forged letters were full of supposed expressions of love, the language so convincing that it seemed impossible they weren't real. As the whispers grew louder, Catherine's mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening, her throat tightening with panic. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though her very voice had been stolen by the weight of the accusations. Her eyes swept over the crowd, searching for a familiar face, her parents' faces, but they were not the ones she hoped for. Her father's face was a mask of fury and disbelief, his shoulders stiff with shame, while her mother, oblivious to the seriousness of the moment, looked on with an expression of confusion, not understanding the severity of the betrayal. The whispers grew louder, and one by one, her so-called friends began to turn away from her, unable to stand by her in the face of such scandal. Then a voice spoke up, her maid, a woman who had served her faithfully, but now, with a look of guilt and fear in her eyes, confirmed the worst. She had seen Catherine meeting with James Worthing in secret. The maid's testimony, easily bribed, sealed Catherine's fate. Her entire existence had been reduced to a scandalous rumor, a web of lies spun so intricately that no one would believe the truth. Frozen in place, Catherine felt the room closing in on her, the weight of her public humiliation sinking deeper into her bones. She had no defense, no way to undo what had been done. As she stood there, utterly exposed, her heart shattered with the knowledge that she was now a pariah. The silence that followed was suffocating, but Catherine's world was too chaotic for her to even process the looks of disdain, the gasps of judgment. As she began to walk on the stage, her heart broke with each step. Her parents' eyes avoided hers, and her friends turned their backs. There was no escaping the crushing weight of the world she had once known. Her life, her future, her dignity, gone. She felt like a ghost, walking to the grand staircase, her steps echoing in the silence of the mansion. The footmen wouldn't meet her eyes, and the servants whispered behind her back as she passed through the entrance hall, out into the night. The rain was now falling in sheets, each drop hitting her skin like the accusations that rained down on her. No cloak to shield her from the cold, no warmth to offer comfort, just the raw, biting sting of reality. She walked, aimlessly, without destination, without purpose, numb to everything around her. The storm mirrored her emotions, a cacophony of chaos and grief. Her body was cold. Her gown clung to her in sodden misery, and yet it was nothing compared to the coldness that now gripped her heart. She had been abandoned by everyone who mattered, betrayed by the man she loved, and her future seemed like nothing more than a distant memory. It felt as though her life had been stolen, and there was no way to reclaim it. She didn't know how long she had been walking when the carriage appeared, its black lacquer gleaming despite the rain, the horses steady and poised. The ducal crest was unfamiliar, but it seemed almost otherworldly in the midst of her disarray. The carriage rolled beside her, matching her stumbling pace, before it came to a slow, deliberate stop. The door swung open, and the voice from within was low, commanding, "Get in." Catherine barely registered the words, her mind too overwhelmed with grief and shock to process the offer. Her eyes lifted, meeting the eyes of the man who sat inside. He was tall, with dark, intense eyes and an air of authority that felt like a stark contrast to her broken world. His hand extended toward her, a lifeline in the chaos, though she hesitated for just a moment. His voice, sharper now, sliced through the storm. "Get in. You'll die of cold before morning." And with that, Catherine, unable to resist, stepped into the carriage, not knowing what fate awaited her, but knowing that, for now, the night had brought her a stranger who could, perhaps, offer her the briefest respite from the devastation that had been her life. She didn't know how long she'd been walking when the carriage appeared, black lacquer gleaming despite the rain, horses perfectly matched, a ducal crest she didn't recognize. It rolled beside her, matching her stumbling pace. Then it stopped. The door of the carriage swung open, and Catherine stood frozen for a moment, staring at the man who had spoken. His hand, large and strong, was extended toward her. She hesitated, her mind still a swirl of confusion and disbelief. The rain pelted her skin, but the warmth from the interior of the carriage beckoned like a lifeline. The man's gaze never wavered as he regarded her with an intensity that seemed to read her very soul. The coldness of the night and the weight of the storm outside were nothing compared to the weight of the moment. She could see the ducal crest on the carriage, and something in her mind registered a warning. But her body was already moving, drawn to the promise of warmth, of a brief escape from a nightmare that had become her life. Her fingers brushed his, and she allowed herself to be helped into the carriage, feeling the heat from the interior embrace her, the plush seats beneath her offering a strange comfort she hadn't known in hours. The door shut behind her with a soft thud, sealing her away from the world she had just lost. She glanced up, fully taking in the man sitting opposite her. He was tall, with dark, intense eyes that seemed to miss nothing, his face handsome in a way that was both commanding and cold. There was something about him that demanded respect, an air of authority that made her feel small and yet oddly safe. He was in his early 30s. His dark hair swept back from his sharp brow, and there was a scar just above his left eyebrow, a mark that gave him an almost dangerous edge. His gaze remained fixed on her, and she shifted uncomfortably under the intensity of his scrutiny. "You're freezing," he said, his voice a low, gravelly tone that seemed to carry a weight of experience, as though it seemed far more of life than he cared to recount. Without waiting for her response, he draped a thick blanket over her shoulders. She didn't move, still too stunned by the surreal nature of the moment to speak or act. His fingers brushed the edge of her shoulder as he adjusted the blanket, but he didn't make any further attempt to touch her. Catherine could feel the warmth spreading through her, her body starting to relax as the chill rain was replaced by the warmth of the carriage. The silence between them was heavy, but she couldn't bring herself to break it. What could she say? She had no words, no explanation for how she had ended up in this stranger's carriage. She didn't know who he was or why he was helping her, but in this moment, she was beyond caring. His eyes were still on her, studying her in a way that felt almost clinical, as though he were piecing together some puzzle that only he could see. Finally, he spoke again. "Why would you help me?" Her voice sounded strange, hoarse, as if she had been holding it back for far too long. He didn't answer immediately, just continued to watch her with that intense, piercing gaze. There was something about him, something unsettling, but also strangely comforting. He seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets, of a life lived in shadows and silence, and for some reason, that made her trust him, at least trust him enough to listen. "I was at the ball," he said quietly, his voice taking on a weight that seemed to belong to someone who had lived through betrayal, someone who knew the cost of trust and lies. "I saw everything." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. "You saw—" She trailed off, not able to finish the thought. The accusation, the scandal, the lies, it was all too much to process. He nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I recognize a pattern. The forged letters, the false accusations, the way they try to destroy you in front of everyone. I've seen it before. 7 years ago, it happened to me." His words hung in the air, heavy with a pain she could almost feel. "I was accused of cheating at cards," he continued, his voice growing quieter, more distant, as though the memory pained him. "It was a lie, but the evidence was there, false but convincing. I was exiled to the continent, away from everyone I knew, until I could clear my name. It took years to prove my innocence, and by the time I did, the damage had been done. Society forgave me my title, but they never forgot the accusation." Catherine's mind raced, and she stared at him in disbelief. She hadn't expected this man, this stranger, to reveal something so personal, so painful, but in some strange way, it made her feel less alone. Her heart, still broken from the events of the evening, found a flicker of understanding in his words. He had been destroyed once, too, but he had survived. "I saw you walking away from a ball," he continued, his voice more composed now. "I saw the same thing I went through, shock, humiliation, but also that quiet dignity. You weren't broken, even though you had every right to be." Catherine swallowed, trying to hold back the swell of emotion that threatened to break free. She had been walking away in silence, too numb to do anything else. But his words made her see that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been as broken as she had thought. "I know what it looks like," he said softly, "when someone is destroyed by carefully crafted lies. And I know what it takes to survive." For a moment, there was silence between them. The weight of his words hung in the air like a fragile thread, connecting them in a way that was both strange and comforting. She wasn't alone in this fight. He had been there, too, and he understood. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice quieter, as if the decision he was about to make weighed heavily on him. "I can help you," he said, his gaze steady. "I can offer you sanctuary. My townhouse in Mayfair. You'll be safe there. You can take the time to recover, to think about what you want to do next." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "No expectations, no demands. Tomorrow, you'll decide what to do. But tonight, you need shelter. You need rest." Catherine met his eyes, searching for any hint of ulterior motives, but found none. His offer, simple as it was, felt like the first piece of kindness she had been shown in hours. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, and the thought of retreating into the warmth of his home, even if it meant remaining in his debt, felt like the only choice left. She nodded slowly, too tired to speak, her emotions still raw and tangled. There was nothing left for her in the world she had once known. For now, this strange man, this Duke of Thornwick, was the only thing standing between her and the darkness that seemed to swallow her whole. As the carriage rolled through London's rain-slicked streets toward Mayfair, Catherine realized she was in a duke's carriage, ruined and unchaperoned, heading toward a scandal that would make tonight's accusations look innocent. And she didn't care. What more could they take from her? The carriage finally came to a stop before an imposing townhouse in Mayfair, its grandeur stark against the grim backdrop of the rainy night. Thornwick House. Catherine hadn't known what to expect, but this mansion, with its large, dark stone facade, towering windows, and air of quiet authority, was nothing like the life she had known. A sense of surrealism clung to her as she stepped down from the carriage. The grandeur of it all seemed almost a mockery of her current state, ruined, disgraced, and yet unexpectedly offered refuge in this opulent fortress. The door opened before she could even step up the steps, revealing a housekeeper, a warm, motherly woman named Mrs. Peters, who immediately welcomed her with a smile that seemed to radiate comfort. She ushered Catherine inside without a word of judgment, just a quiet kindness that made Catherine's chest tighten. As the warmth of the foyer enveloped her, Catherine could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her shoulders. Her body, cold and stiff from the rain, screamed for rest, but she couldn't yet bring herself to relax. "You must be exhausted, my lady," Mrs. Peters said, her voice soft but full of authority. "Come, let me prepare a bath for you." Catherine nodded numbly, too tired to speak, and followed the housekeeper upstairs to a large, comfortable bedchamber. It was luxurious, the bed draped in soft velvet and satin, a fire crackling gently in the hearth. Catherine sank onto the bed for just a moment, allowing herself to breathe. As Mrs. Peters prepared the bath, Catherine caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her gown, soaked and dirty, clung to her body like the remnants of her former life. The woman staring back at her was unfamiliar, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. But what struck her most was the emptiness in her expression. She wasn't crying, not yet, but she could feel the tears building, a storm waiting to break. She had lost everything in a matter of hours: her engagement, her place in society, her family's respect. She had been torn apart, exposed to the cruel judgments of the world. But here, in this strange, quiet place, she could almost pretend she was someone else. A woman who hadn't been humiliated in front of the most important people in London. A woman who had not been cast aside. When the bath was ready, Mrs. Peters helped Catherine undress, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Catherine felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. The warm water enveloped her, and she allowed herself to close her eyes, her body relaxing against the soothing heat. It was a moment of peace amidst the chaos, but the storm inside her raged on. Catherine woke to the faint light of dawn creeping through the curtains. For a moment, she forgot where she was, the unfamiliar surroundings disorienting her. But as her memory flooded back, the reality of the previous night came crashing over her. She was alone. Her engagement had been publicly shattered, her name dragged through the mud. The whispers, the accusations, they had all been real, and there was no escaping them. She forced herself out of bed, her body sore from the strain of the previous day, and she walked toward the door. To her surprise, there was a stack of morning papers placed discreetly outside her room. She picked them up with trembling hands and sat down, her heart racing as she scanned the headlines. Viscount's daughter's disgrace screamed the bold print, the lurid details of her downfall spilling out onto the pages. The words blurred before her eyes as she tried to read, but the truth was there, plain and unforgiving. The details about Mr. Worthing, her supposed secret lover, were published with such detail it felt as though her entire life had been exposed. There were no kind words, no offers of support, only speculation and mockery. Then, as if on cue, a letter was slipped under her door. It was from her father, written in a stiff, formal hand. "To preserve our family's reputation," the letter began, "we must part ways. I am disowning you. You are no longer welcome in Ashford House. Your belongings will be sent to your aunt in Yorkshire." Catherine's hand trembled as she read the words, the final blow to the family she had once been a part of. There was no mention of sympathy, no offer of understanding, just cold, pragmatic dismissal. Her parents had abandoned her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She would never go back. There was no return to the life she had known. There was only the future and whatever it held. She sat for a long time, her head in her hands, trying to gather the fragments of her shattered world. No one had come to her defense. Not one friend had written. Not one person had reached out to offer comfort. Her phone was silent, and the silence screamed louder than any words could. It was only when a soft knock came at the door that Catherine's thoughts were broken. She looked up to see the Duke of Thornwick standing in the doorway. He looked just as imposing as he had the night before, his dark eyes studying her with an unreadable expression. "I've been awake all night," he said quietly, stepping inside. "I wanted to know how you were." His words were oddly comforting, but Catherine couldn't bring herself to speak just yet. He crossed the room and sat down beside her, not looking at her with pity, but with an unsettling sort of understanding. "I've learned some things," he said, his voice low and calm. "Philip, for one, he's deeply in debt from gambling. I also learned about Miss Blackwood, your rival. She's far more than that." Catherine listened as the Duke explained what he had uncovered. Vivian Blackwood, the woman who had always seemed so perfect, had financed the forgeries. the letters that had destroyed her life. It was clear now that Vivian had a very different motive than just winning Philip's heart. She had wanted Catherine gone out of the picture entirely, and she had done everything she could to make sure that happened. Philip was desperate, the Duke continued, his voice growing colder with each word. He was just another pawn in this. Vivian knew exactly what she was doing, and she used him as much as she used you. Catherine's heart twisted at the thought of how easily she had been manipulated. But the Duke's words gave her a flicker of clarity. He was right. Philip had never truly loved her. He had only wanted to escape his debts. Vivian had wanted him, and she had orchestrated the entire downfall. They expected you to retreat quietly, the Duke said. They didn't expect you to fight. You have a choice, the Duke said quietly. I can send you to my estate in Cornwall. Quiet, life, safety, anonymity. Or you can stay here, fight back, and rebuild. But I warn you, my help comes with its own scandal. Society will assume the worst about why you're in my home. Catherine met his gray eyes steadily. They already assumed the worst, your grace. What more can they take from me? Catherine sat in the grand room of Thornwick House, her fingers tapping absently on the edge of the table as the Duke's words echoed in her mind. Cornwall, safety, anonymity, and a life in the shadows, away from the whispers of society. Or stay, fight back, and rebuild her life from the ruins that Philip and Vivian had left behind. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, but as she looked across the room at the Duke, she knew what her choice had to be. She was not a woman to hide in the shadows, to retreat to a quiet life of obscurity. She had not come this far, not endured the shame and humiliation of the ball and the subsequent fallout, just to run away now. She would fight, no matter the cost. I choose to stay, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. I won't hide. I won't let them win. Let them think what they will. I'll show them I'm not broken. The Duke regarded her with quiet admiration, his piercing gray eyes studying her face as though weighing her resolve. He had warned her of the scandal she would face by accepting his help, but Catherine was beyond caring. What more could they take from her? She had already lost everything. She was not going to let them strip her of her will, her dignity, or her right to fight for justice. She would rebuild her life, piece by piece, and the world would see that she was not the weak, helpless woman they assumed her to be. You're certain? The Duke asked, his voice low, almost as if testing her. Catherine nodded, her gaze unwavering. I am. I won't hide in Cornwall. I'm not some fragile woman who needs to be tucked away out of sight. I will stand and face them. Let them see me stand tall, unashamed. Let them see that I will not be destroyed by lies. The Duke studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly, a faint but approving smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Very well, Lady Catherine. We'll begin tomorrow. We'll find the forger. We'll expose the truth, and we'll make them pay for what they've done. He stood, his tall figure imposing yet comforting, and walked toward the door. But remember, he said, pausing in the doorway and turning back to her, this will not be easy. It will take time, and society will make it difficult for you. There will be whispers, and people will judge you, some of them even worse than before. Catherine met his eyes, her chest swelling with a quiet determination. Let them judge. Let them say whatever they want. I will show them that I am not their victim. I will fight and I will win. As the Duke left her alone with her thoughts, Catherine stood from the table, her mind racing. She had chosen the harder path, the one filled with uncertainty and risk, but it was a path that would allow her to take back control of her life. And as the days passed, she would find that the fight would not only be for her name, but for something far more important, her very sense of self-worth. The battle was just beginning, and Catherine Ashford was ready to face whatever came next. The next few days were spent in quiet preparation. The Duke, though a man of few words, outlined the steps they would take to clear Catherine's name. First, they were to find the forger, whoever had written the false letters that had so easily destroyed her reputation. It wasn't going to be easy. Forgers were skilled at covering their tracks, and finding him would require time and patience. We need concrete evidence, the Duke explained one evening as they sat together, poring over notes. We need to prove that the letters weren't just forged, but that they were part of a larger conspiracy. If we rush this, we'll only make things worse. Catherine nodded, her mind sharp and focused. The Duke's approach was methodical and precise, qualities that Catherine admired. But beyond that, she found herself respecting his strength. He had been through his own ordeal, and it was clear that he understood the emotional and strategic weight of what she was facing. They spent hours together each day, planning and strategizing. They discussed the forger, the maid who had been bribed to testify against her, and the potential avenues for finding proof of Vivian Blackwood's involvement. The more they worked together, the more Catherine realized how much she had underestimated the Duke. He was not just a man of wealth and status. He was a man of intellect, and his mind was a formidable ally in this battle. But even as their plans took shape, the reality of what they were about to undertake loomed large. To expose the truth, Catherine would have to make herself visible again, something that terrified her. Society would be watching, waiting for her to slip, to falter, and they would pounce on any weakness. The Duke proposed that Catherine begin attending social events with him. His protection would be explicit, but the public would see that she was not hiding, not retreating into isolation. You need to show strength, he said, his voice calm but insistent. People will respect you if you do, but if you disappear into the shadows, they'll believe the lies. Catherine took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her. It would be a bold move, but one that could help her reclaim some measure of control. I'll do it, she said quietly, meeting his eyes with a renewed sense of resolve. I'll show them that I am not afraid. The following afternoon, as Catherine was preparing for the evening, a new arrival made herself known in the household. The Dowager Duchess Eleanor, the Duke's mother. Catherine had heard whispers of her, of course, but nothing could prepare her for the sharp-eyed, no-nonsense woman who walked into the room. She was tall, regal, and exuded an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. At first, Catherine expected disapproval. After all, the Dowager was from a world of high society, where reputation and public image were everything. But to her surprise, the Dowager seemed to take an immediate liking to her. "I've heard about you, my dear," the Dowager said with a sharp smile as she looked Catherine over, her eyes assessing yet not unkind. A fine young woman, despite the unfortunate circumstances. Catherine bristled at the comment, but held her tongue. The Dowager's keen gaze didn't miss much, and before long, she had brought up a matter that Catherine had not considered. "I, too, have had my share of scandal," the Dowager said, her voice carrying a strange wave of experience. False rumors, lies, the sort of thing that can ruin a woman's reputation overnight. But I survived because I refused to hide. I refused to be defined by lies. Catherine listened, entranced by the quiet strength the Dowager exuded. In a world where silence often equaled guilt, the Dowager's survival had come from facing the storm head-on, refusing to retreat into obscurity. Catherine realized then that the Duke's mother was not just offering her sympathy. She was offering her wisdom, drawn from years of experience. "I'll help you, my dear," the Dowager continued. "We'll make sure that you are seen. I'll sponsor you, and we'll attend Lady Pemberton's ball next week. If you can face that crowd, you can face anyone." Catherine nodded, feeling a strange sense of hope flicker inside her. For the first time in days, she felt like she had a place in the world again, a chance to prove that she would not be defined by the lies told about her. And perhaps, just perhaps, this new alliance would be the key to her redemption. As the days passed, Catherine found herself noticing the Duke in ways she hadn't before. His presence, always strong and commanding, seemed to draw her in with an intensity she hadn't expected. They spent more time together, their conversations ranging from estate management to politics, and sometimes to quieter, more personal matters. He respected her intelligence, challenging her mind in ways that no one had before. And though they both remained guarded, there was an undeniable spark between them, a tension that grew each time their eyes met, each time their hands brushed as they worked side by side. Catherine wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere between the planning and the long hours spent together, she began to see him not just as the man who was helping her, but as something more, someone whose presence made her feel alive again, despite everything that had happened. She could feel the attraction building, but she also knew better than to entertain it. There were more important matters at hand. Still, she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her whenever their eyes met, or the flutter in her chest whenever he spoke her name with that quiet intensity. But Catherine knew that for now, she needed to focus on the battle ahead. It was a fight for her name, her reputation, and her future. There would be time for everything else later. Lady Pemberton's ball, the Dowager said with satisfaction, is where London's highest society gathers. If Catherine can face them there, she can face anyone. Alexander will escort you formally. Let them see the Duke of Thornwick has chosen his side. Catherine's heart raced. A week. She had 1 week to prepare to face the people who destroyed her and show them they'd failed. The days leading up to Lady Pemberton's ball were filled with a constant flurry of activity. Catherine found herself enveloped in the whirlwind of preparations, both practical and personal. The Duke's townhouse became her new world, a strange blend of luxury and tension. Catherine threw herself into work, accompanying the Duke as he managed his affairs, learning the intricacies of estate management, politics, and even philosophy. To her surprise, she discovered a sharp mind beneath his stoic exterior. Their discussions became a daily routine, and Catherine found herself relishing the challenge of their sparring conversations. The more she spoke with him, the more she realized that there was a depth to him that she hadn't initially seen. It was not just his titles or his wealth that made him formidable. It was his intelligence, his quiet strength, and his unspoken understanding of the pain of being publicly destroyed. He never treated her as a fragile woman who needed to be protected. Instead, he treated her as an equal, someone worthy of being listened to. Their connection deepened, not in grand gestures, but in the way they challenged each other's thoughts, in the rare moments of shared silence that spoke volumes. At the same time, the Dowager Duchess Eleanor arrived to oversee her transformation. Catherine had expected a hard, critical edge, but what she found instead was a no-nonsense pragmatism and a deep well of kindness. The Dowager took charge of Catherine's wardrobe, pushing her to wear rich, jewel-toned gowns that would showcase her strength and maturity, rather than the pastel shades she had once favored as a debutante. Each dress, tailored to perfection, made Catherine feel as though she were shedding her past. It wasn't just the clothes, it was the way she carried herself. As the week progressed, the mirror reflected a woman who was no longer a victim of circumstance, but one who had embraced the fight ahead. The practice sessions were grueling, but Catherine never faltered. She worked with the utmost dedication to perfect her posture, her confidence, and her presence. Each step was calculated, a movement that would send a message to the world that she was not broken, not ruined. She learned to walk as if she were the equal of anyone in the room, head high, eyes steady. She was determined that when the day came, the world would see a woman reborn, not a woman running from her past, but one who had learned to fight back. During this time, Catherine also began to notice subtle shifts in the Duke's behavior. Though he remained just as focused on their goal, there were moments when their proximity seemed to affect him. A lingering touch when passing documents, a shared glance that held a bit more than just professional respect. Catherine tried to push the thoughts aside. There was no time for distractions, but the pull between them grew undeniable. Still, there was something unspoken between them, a quiet tension that neither acknowledged. Perhaps it was the weight of the circumstances they were in, or perhaps it was something deeper that neither of them was yet ready to confront. But the attraction was there, simmering just below the surface. With each passing day, the countdown to Lady Pemberton's ball loomed closer, and Catherine found herself both anxious and oddly exhilarated. She was no longer the frightened woman who had walked away from the ball in disgrace. She was someone else entirely, stronger, more confident, and ready to face the storm. The time for hiding was over. While Catherine's personal transformation was underway, the Duke's investigation continued relentlessly. His men scoured London, following leads and piecing together the fragment of evidence that could expose the lies that had destroyed Catherine's life. They traced the forger's movements, identified the distinctive paper used in the forged letters, and even managed to track down the maid who had been bribed to testify against Catherine. The maid, it seemed, had disappeared into the countryside with the money she'd been paid. But the Duke's men were persistent. They followed every lead, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. The investigation was slow, but steady progress was made. However, they still lacked one crucial piece of evidence: proof that Vivian Blackwood had orchestrated the entire scheme. Catherine had always suspected that Vivian was behind it all, but suspicion wasn't enough to clear her name. They needed concrete proof, something irrefutable, something that would make the public see the truth. The Duke's men had uncovered a number of key details, including the fact that Philip was drowning in debt, his future uncertain. Vivian, on the other hand, was wealthy and powerful, and it became clear that her pursuit of Philip wasn't just about love. It was about securing her own future, no matter the cost. The timing of the engagement ball had been too perfect. Catherine had been the victim of a carefully orchestrated plan, designed to humiliate her in front of society and clear the way for Vivian to take her place. As Catherine learned these details, she couldn't help but feel a sickening sense of betrayal. She had trusted Philip, loved him, and yet he had been nothing more than a pawn in Vivian's game. The deeper they dug, the more obvious it became that Vivian had played a central role in the destruction of Catherine's reputation. But there was still no hard evidence connecting Vivian to the forgeries or to the bribe made. The pieces were there, but they were scattered, waiting to be put together. The night before Lady Pemberton's ball, Catherine found herself standing before the mirror, dressed in a gown of deep emerald green that the dowager had insisted she wear. The color was bold, sophisticated, far removed from the pale pink she would have once chosen. As she studied her reflection, Catherine was struck by how much she had changed. The woman staring back at her was unrecognizable from the girl who had walked into the engagement ball just days before. This woman had strength in her eyes, a fire that had been kindled through pain and loss. She had learned not just how to survive, but how to fight. The tension in her chest tightened as she thought of the ball. It was a trial by fire, and she would be walking into the lion's den, unarmed but resolute. She was not just fighting for her reputation. She was fighting for her future, her right to be seen for who she truly was, not the distorted image the world had created. She was jolted from her thoughts by a quiet knock on the door. The Duke stepped in, his tall figure framed by the doorway. His eyes locked on her, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. "You look," his words trailed off, as though he had been struck by something unexpected. Catherine held his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. "I'm ready," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the nerves that ran through her. He stepped forward, his usual cool demeanor momentarily slipping as he looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "Say the word and we can stop." Catherine shook her head, her resolve firm. "No, I need them to see me, see that I survived, see that I'm not afraid." The moment stretched between them, an unspoken understanding passing in the silence. Then, with a soft sigh, he nodded. "Tomorrow they will see you, and they'll regret ever underestimating you." As Catherine retired to her chamber, she studied herself in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the naive girl who'd walked into that engagement ball a week ago. This woman had survived destruction. Tomorrow, she'd walk back into the lion's den not as prey, but as someone who'd learned to bite back. The night of Lady Pemberton's ball arrived with an air of anticipation that seemed to hang heavy over London. The grand ballroom, with its glittering chandeliers and polished marble floors, was filled with London's most esteemed guests. Catherine's heart raced in her chest as the carriage rolled to a stop in front of the impressive manor. She felt the weight of 1,000 eyes already upon her, though they had not yet seen her. Her pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, she questioned whether she was making a mistake. The world was waiting for her to fail, to crumble under the pressure, but she couldn't turn back now. With a steadying breath, she stepped out of the carriage, the hem of her emerald gown brushing against the cobblestones. The Duke was beside her, his presence solid and unwavering, a silent promise of protection. His arm, strong and reassuring, was offered to her, and she accepted it with the resolve of a woman who had come too far to retreat. The moment they entered the ballroom, all conversation ceased. Every eye turned toward her. There was a sharp, immediate shift in the room, a mixture of whispers, stares, and the silent judgment of society that had once adored her, now eager to watch her fall. But Catherine stood tall, her head held high, every step purposeful and composed. The Duke's presence beside her was commanding, and she could feel the weight of his support behind her. His hand, subtly placed at the small of her back, steadied her as they moved through the sea of staring faces. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she realized how many of these people had once been her friends, her peers, and yet now they seemed to regard her with a mixture of pity and disdain. She could hear the faint murmurs. "How dare she show her face?" one woman hissed, while another whispered, "She's got nerve, I'll give her that." But there was no turning back now. She would not be reduced to the woman they thought she was. As they moved through the ballroom, Lady Pemberton herself came forward to greet them, her smile tight but polite. "Lady Catherine," she said with a nod, her voice just loud enough to be heard by those around them. "How brave of you to show your face tonight." The words were a compliment, but there was something biting in the delivery. Catherine met her gaze steadily, refusing to show any hint of discomfort. "Thank you, Lady Pemberton," she replied, her voice calm, her smile cool but unbroken. Behind her, the whispers intensified, but Catherine didn't flinch. She was no longer the naive young woman who had entered the engagement ball weeks ago. Tonight, she would show them a woman who had learned to stand tall in the face of destruction. The ballroom was an arena, and Catherine was walking into it with no illusions. The Duke's presence beside her was both a shield and a challenge. He had been adamant that she show strength, and now, as they made their way through the room, Catherine could feel the weight of every eye on her. Some faces were filled with open scorn, others with curiosity, and a few with faint, barely disguised pity. The energy in the room was charged, as though everyone was waiting for her to slip, to make a mistake. But she didn't. She walked through the ballroom with the poise and confidence she had practiced for days, her back straight, her chin lifted. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't crumbling. She was reclaiming her space. The Duke claimed the first dance, as though daring anyone to question his actions, and without hesitation, Catherine accepted. As they moved onto the dance floor, a hushed silence fell over the crowd. She could feel the eyes of the entire ballroom trained on them. They were watching for signs of weakness, hoping she would falter, hoping she would shrink away. But she wouldn't. As the music swelled, the Duke's steady, assured presence next to her calmed her nerves, and she found herself moving with him in time, her body responding naturally to his lead. The whispers grew louder, but Catherine didn't let them in. With every step, every turn, she showed them that she was not the woman they thought her to be. She was not broken, not defeated. She was still Catherine Ashford. And as she moved, she could feel a shift in the room, a subtle one at first, then more noticeable. Some of the men in the room, once so quick to dismiss her, now regarded her with a new kind of interest. They saw her not as a fragile woman in need of protection, but as someone worthy of respect. The Duke's hand was firm at her waist, but his gaze was warm as he guided her through the dance, an unspoken promise in his eyes that he would be with her every step of the way. The dance itself was a statement, a declaration that she was still a force to be reckoned with. The ballroom may have been an arena, but she would not be the prey. Just as Catherine began to feel the thrill of the dance, a familiar, unwelcome figure emerged from the crowd. Vivian Blackwood, the woman who had orchestrated her downfall, stood at the edge of the dance floor, her gaze fixed on Catherine with a smug, almost triumphant smile. Catherine's stomach twisted, but she refused to let it show. Vivian approached them with a false sweetness, her voice dripping with insincerity. "How brave of you to show your face, dear Catherine," she said, her eyes gleaming with barely hidden satisfaction. "It must take a great deal of courage to face the people who know what you truly are." The words were meant to wound, to weaken her, but Catherine only smiled, her composure unshaken. "How kind of you to notice, Miss Blackwood," she replied smoothly, her voice just as sweet. "I understand congratulations are in order on your acquisition of Lord Hartley." Vivian's smile faltered just for a second before she recovered. Her eyes narrowed, and Catherine could see the subtle shift in her expression, the momentary crack in her otherwise perfect mask. Vivian was not as secure as she appeared. The subtext was clear, and everyone in earshot caught it. Vivian had wanted Philip for herself. She had always wanted him. But now the truth was out, and Catherine had the upper hand. Before Vivian could respond, Lord Philip Hartley himself appeared, walking toward her with a carefully neutral expression on his face. "Lady Catherine," he said, his voice dripping with false civility, "I'm so sorry to see you in such unfortunate circumstances." Catherine stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. The Duke's hand at her back was the only thing keeping her grounded as he moved between her and Philip, his tone icy. "Lord Hartley, I don't believe Lady Catherine desires your company." Philip hesitated, then shot the Duke a glance, clearly trying to gauge whether he should argue, but the Duke's cold, aristocratic air made him hesitate, and slowly Philip turned away, retreating into the crowd. Vivian, too, turned on her heel, her expression twisted with frustration and calculation. Catherine stood there, feeling the eyes of the room upon her, but she didn't care. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of victory. She had faced them, not as the woman they wanted her to be, but as the woman she truly was. She was no longer prey. She was the hunter. As the Duke led Catherine back onto the dance floor, she caught sight of Vivian's expression, no longer smug but calculating. Worried. Good. Let her worry. Let her wonder what Catherine knew, what the Duke was planning. The destroyed mouse had returned as something far more dangerous. The carriage ride back to Thornwick House was quieter than Catherine had expected, but it was filled with a sense of quiet triumph. As they rolled through the wet streets of London, she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. The whispers, the cold stares, they were still there, but there was something different now. The silence of the ball had been punctuated by tension and judgment, but Catherine had faced them all without flinching. As the door to Thornwick House opened, and the Duke helped her inside, the weight of the evening seemed to lift from her shoulders. Inside, the warmth of the house embraced her, and she felt herself relax, though a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She had done it. She had faced a lion's den, and she had come out on top. "You were magnificent, my dear," the Dowager Duchess Eleanor said, her sharp eyes gleaming with approval as she came forward to greet them. "I've never seen a woman handle herself so well in the face of such public scorn." The praise from the Dowager was unexpected but not unearned. Catherine felt a surge of pride, but it was tempered by the realization that this was just the beginning. She had not won yet. There were still battles to be fought, enemies to be exposed. But for the first time in weeks, she felt as though she might actually have a chance. "You showed them exactly what I knew you were," the Duke said, his voice low but filled with something like respect as he stood beside her. Catherine glanced up at him, the weight of the moment sinking in. There had been something in his eyes tonight, something beyond the professional, beyond the strategic help he had given her. She knew he had seen something in her, but it was unclear whether it was admiration, respect, or something more. Whatever it was clear that their connection had grown in ways that neither of them had expected. As the Duke moved toward the study, Catherine stood for a moment in the foyer, looking out at the dark, rain-soaked streets of London. She had felt their eyes on her, the judgment, the cold distance, but she had not bent to their will. She had faced the challenge head-on and survived. She could already feel the shift in the way people looked at her. Some still whispered, some still judged, but others were beginning to wonder if they had misjudged her, wonder if she had the strength to rise above it all. The silence of the house felt almost comforting now, as though Thornwick House had become her sanctuary from the storm that still raged outside. But Catherine knew the storm was far from over. The next morning, after a brief night's rest, Catherine joined the Duke in his study. He was already at work, as usual, his eyes scanning through documents, his mind focused. But when he saw her enter, he paused for just a moment, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that sent a strange shiver down her spine. "I have news," he said, his voice low but urgent. "It's a breakthrough." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. They had been searching for the forger, piecing together the threads of conspiracy, but so far they had only uncovered fragments. The maid, the letters, Philip's debts, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle. But they had yet to find the smoking gun that would expose Vivian Blackwood for the manipulative, calculating woman she truly was. "We've found the forger," the Duke continued, his expression steely. "His name is Thomas Gaines. He's been operating in 7 Dial for years, using high-quality materials and forging documents for anyone willing to pay. He kept records. He's meticulous." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Thomas Gaines was the missing piece of the puzzle. "And the maid?" she asked, her voice tense with anticipation. "She's been traced as well, the Duke replied. "She fled with the money, but we have a lead on her. She's been hiding out in the countryside. We'll find her soon enough." The revelation was a victory, but it also brought with it a sense of urgency. They had to act quickly before Vivian and Philip realized they were being hunted. "We'll confront him tomorrow," the Duke said, his voice calm and steady. "We'll get him to testify, and with that testimony, we'll have everything we need to expose Vivian and Philip." Catherine nodded, her mind racing with the implications of the breakthrough. They were so close, but there was still the matter of Vivian's involvement. They needed more, something concrete that would tie her to the forgery, to the conspiracy. The thought of Vivian, walking through society as if she had done nothing wrong, made Catherine's blood boil. She had to be stopped. The forger's testimony would be crucial, but they still needed to make sure they had irrefutable evidence to bring Vivian down. As the Duke's men began preparing for confrontation with Gaines, Catherine knew she couldn't just sit back and let the Duke handle everything. This was her fight, her name at stake. She couldn't stand by while others fought for her. "I'm coming," she said firmly as she stood in the study, facing the Duke. He looked up at her, surprised by her determination. "It's too dangerous," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Seven Dials is a dangerous place. I won't have you risking your safety for this." Catherine met his gaze, unwavering. "This is my fight," she said, her voice steady. "I won't be left behind. I'm coming with you." The Duke hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to protect her and respecting her resolve. "It's not safe," he repeated, his tone softer now. "But if you insist," he sighed, a look of reluctant acceptance crossing his face. "Fine, but we'll take precautions. We'll have armed footmen with us, and we'll go during the day. No risks." Catherine nodded. The Duke's protective instincts were obvious, but she couldn't afford to sit idly by. This was about more than just exposing the truth. It was about taking back control of her life, and she wasn't going to let anyone dictate how she fought her battles. That evening, as they sat together in the library, preparing for the next day's confrontation, Catherine found herself more and more aware of the Duke's presence. The quiet moments they shared, the conversations that meandered from the strategic to the personal, brought them closer in a way neither had anticipated. The shared vulnerability in their words, the unspoken understanding between them, created a bond that was stronger than either of them had expected. The Duke, for all his calculated moves and guarded demeanor, began to reveal more of himself, his past, his exile, his loneliness. And Catherine, in turn, shared part of her own story, of the pressure of society's expectations, of the life she had once thought she would lead. In these quiet moments, Catherine began to realize just how deeply she had come to care for him. But it was more than just gratitude for his help. There was something else, something more personal, that she could no longer ignore. Their connection was undeniable, and though neither of them spoke of it directly, it was there, lingering in the space between them. Tomorrow they confront the forger. Tomorrow they gain evidence to destroy Philip and Vivian's lies. But tonight, Catherine lay awake thinking not about vindication, but about Alexander's gray eyes, his careful hands, the way he said her name. Somewhere between seeking justice and seeking revenge, she'd found something she hadn't been looking for at all. The next morning, Catherine prepared herself for the journey to Seven Dials with a mixture of resolve and anxiety. The streets of Mayfair seemed a world away from the grim reality of the district they were about to enter. As they made their way through the city, Catherine noticed a stark contrast between the wealth of her world and the grim poverty of Seven Dials. The streets grew narrower, the buildings shabbier, and the air thicker with the smell of the poor and the desperate. The Duke's carriage, which had once felt like a symbol of safety and power, now felt like a fragile bubble in the midst of a dangerous world. Despite the protective presence of the Duke's armed footmen, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in her stomach. She had never been this far from the comfort of her former life, and the rough, crowded streets of Seven Dials felt like a harsh reminder of everything she had lost. The city seemed alive with an energy that both repelled and attracted her. The footmen, ever vigilant, stood by the carriage as the Duke and Catherine made their way to the shabby building where Thomas Gaines, the forger, was reportedly hiding. The neighborhood felt dangerous, filled with a mixture of shadows and whispered deals. The people they passed eyed them warily, and the Duke's imposing presence seemed to cut through the tension. But Catherine could still feel the weight of every gaze. Despite the discomfort, she pushed forward, determined not to be intimidated. This was her fight, and she was not going to shrink away from it. The building where Gaines was supposedly hiding was a far cry from the grandeur of Thornwick House. It was a run-down, shabby building with peeling walls and an air of decay that made Catherine feel uneasy. The Duke's men kept watch outside, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger, but Catherine didn't need protection. She was here for one reason only, to find the truth. The door creaked open, and a man appeared in the doorway. His face was gaunt, his clothes shabby, and his hands shook as he nervously looked at them. This was Thomas Gaines, the forger, though his appearance didn't match the picture Catherine had painted of him in her mind. He seemed small, fragile even, a far cry from the powerful figure behind the scheme that had ruined her. Gaines looked at the Duke with wide, fearful eyes, but it was Catherine who spoke first. "Mr. Gaines," she said, her voice steady, "you have something that belongs to me, something that can clear my name." Gaines shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between her and the Duke. I don't know what you mean," he stammered. But Catherine could see the fear in his eyes, the fear that came from knowing he was cornered, that the truth was about to catch up with him. "You forged the letters that ruined my life," Catherine continued, her voice hardening. "You worked with Vivian Blackwood, and you know the truth." The forger's face paled, and his hands trembled. "I was just doing my job," he mumbled, his voice shaking. "She paid me well. I had no choice." Catherine took a step closer to him. "You always have a choice," she said, her voice cold. "You chose to destroy me. Now, you can choose to make it right." Gaines's eyes flickered nervously to the Duke, and Catherine could see the wheels turning in his mind. "I'll tell you what I know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need protection. I can't go back to the life I had before. I'll be a dead man if I do." The Duke stepped forward, his voice firm. "We'll make sure you're protected, Mr. Gaines. But you will tell us everything you know, every detail. No more lies." Gaines nodded, swallowing hard. I forged the letters. I had to. Vivian Blackwood hired me. She gave me the paper, the ink, everything. She paid me well for it. And I thought it was just a joke. I didn't realize what it would do to her. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest as she listened to his confession. He confirmed everything she had suspected. Vivian Blackwood had orchestrated the entire scheme, using Gaines to ruin her life. But it wasn't just the letters that were forged. There was more to the story. Gaines continued, his voice growing quieter. "Vivian, she paid me to make sure the letters looked real, to make sure they'd be convincing. She wanted her rival out of the way. She wanted Lord Philip for herself, and she wasn't going to let anyone stand in her way." Catherine felt a rush of anger and disgust wash over her as Gaines spoke. Vivian had used her, manipulated her, and Catherine had been too blind to see it. "Where are the letters now?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Gaines swallowed again, his eyes darting nervously around. "I destroyed them. I had to. She told me to. But I kept the records. The payments, the instructions. I got everything she asked me to do written down." He hesitated for a moment, then pulled a small, battered notebook from his pocket and handed it to Catherine. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. The handwriting was unmistakable, Vivian's. There were notes about the engagement, the letters, and the timeline for Catherine's destruction. There were even payment amounts and dates, all recorded in meticulous detail. This was it, the evidence she needed to expose Vivian for the manipulative woman she truly was. But there was still one more piece to the puzzle. "The maid," Catherine said, her voice demanding. "What about the maid who testified against me? Where is she?" Gaines shifted uneasily, then nodded. "She's gone, hidden out in the countryside. I don't know where exactly, but I know she's still alive. She's the one who gave the false testimony, the one who swore she saw you and Worthing together. Vivian paid her too. She promised her money and a new life. But the maid, she's scared. Scared of Vivian. Scared of what'll happen to her if she talks." With the forger's confession and the evidence in hand, The Duke and Catherine made their way back to the carriage, the weight of the moment settling over them. The air felt heavy, but Catherine couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. They had the proof they needed, the evidence to expose Vivian and Philip for what they were. But the Duke's expression remained unreadable, his focus still sharp. As they traveled back through the streets of London, Catherine couldn't help but glance over at him, her thoughts racing. The danger was far from over, and she knew that even with the evidence, they still needed to find a maid, the last crucial piece to bring Vivian's scheme to light. But as they traveled back to Thornwick House, the weight of the journey seemed to fall away. The plan was in motion, and the future, her future, was beginning to take shape. The road ahead was uncertain, but Catherine knew one thing for sure. She was no longer a passive participant in her own life. She was the one in control. "We're close," Alexander said quietly, his hand covering hers on the carriage seat. "Another week, perhaps 2, and we'll have everything we need." Catherine turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. "Thank you for stopping your carriage, for believing me, for this." His gray eyes darkened. "Catherine, I didn't do this only for justice." Before she could respond, the carriage stopped. They arrived at Thornwick House. But something felt wrong. Another carriage waited at the door. A visitor. As the carriage came to a halt before Thornwick House, Catherine felt a strange, inexplicable unease settle in her chest. The familiar grandeur of the mansion, which had once offered her comfort and safety, now seemed somehow foreboding, its cold stone facade standing like a silent sentinel against the approaching storm. The carriage doors opened and Catherine stepped out, her gaze immediately drawn to the second carriage waiting by the entrance. A chill ran through her as she recognized the shape of the vehicle, a sleek, black lacquer, just like the one that had appeared the night she had fled the ball. But this time, the driver was nowhere in sight, and the footmen stood in watchful silence, their faces unreadable. Who could this be? Catherine murmured to herself, a strange sense of foreboding creeping into her thoughts. The Duke stepped down beside her, his usual calm expression betraying a flicker of concern as he turned to her. "I don't know," he said, his voice low and steady, "but something doesn't feel right." They approached the door together, and as it swung open, they were met by Mrs. Peters, who, despite her usual warmth, looked unusually tense. "My lord, my lady," she greeted them, her tone formal, though the concern in her eyes was clear. "There's a visitor waiting for you in the parlor." Catherine's stomach churned as she followed Mrs. Peters down the hallway, the silence between them thick with unanswered questions. As they entered the parlor, Catherine's eyes immediately fixed on the figure seated by the fire. It was a woman, young, with a distressed look on her face. Her clothes were simple, practical, and Catherine immediately felt a sense of recognition. "Miss Margaret Hartley," Catherine whispered in surprise. The woman stood as Catherine, and the Duke entered, her eyes flicking nervously between them. "Lady Catherine," Margaret began, her voice trembling, I don't know where else to turn." She stepped forward, her face flushed with anxiety. "I have information. Information about what happened at the engagement ball." Catherine felt her heart race as she took a step closer. Margaret Hartley, Philip's younger sister, had been a distant acquaintance, but she knew the girl well enough to recognize the guilt and fear in her eyes. "Please tell me," Catherine said softly, urging her to speak. Margaret swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the Duke before she took a deep breath. "I found something. Letters, hidden in Philip's study. They were from Vivian, documents about the plot, the payments, the timing, everything. I didn't know what they meant at first, but when I saw the scandal in the papers and heard about the accusations against you, I realized what it all meant." Catherine's mind whirled as Margaret continued to speak, her words coming faster now. "I was horrified, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to go against my brother, but after everything that happened, I knew I had to tell you the truth." Margaret's voice broke as she looked up at Catherine, her eyes filled with remorse. "I'm so sorry. I should have said something sooner." The room was silent as the weight of Margaret's confession sank in. Catherine's hands clenched into fists as she processed the new revelation. Margaret Hartley, though initially complicit in the silence, had come forward with the one thing Catherine needed. the proof that Vivian Blackwood and Philip Hartley had orchestrated the destruction of her life. She was no longer just a casualty of their scheme. She had been a pawn in a much larger game, and now the truth was unraveling at last. The room was heavy with the silence that followed, and Catherine stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. There was a mixture of anger, disbelief, and something else, something softer, perhaps even gratefulness, that washed over her. Margaret Hartley had betrayed her family, but now she was offering a chance for justice. The girl was clearly struggling with guilt, and though Catherine could feel the sting of betrayal, she also understood the fear and uncertainty that had kept Margaret silent for so long. "Thank you," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions coursing through her. "Thank you for bringing this forward." Margaret nodded, her face pale. I just want to make things right. I couldn't live with the guilt any longer." The sincerity in Margaret's voice was unmistakable, and for the first time in days, Catherine felt a flicker of hope. They had the letters, the smoking gun that would expose Vivian and Philip for what they truly were. But there was still more to do. The maid, the final piece of the puzzle, was still out there, and Catherine knew she couldn't rest until every last lie had been exposed. The truth was within their reach, but the danger was still real. Vivian would not take her defeat quietly, and Catherine knew the coming days would be fraught with challenges. As the evening drew on, the Duke and Catherine sat together, discussing their next steps. The evidence was there, Margaret's testimony, the letters from Philip's study, Gaines' confession, and the details of the payments. But the question remained, how to bring the truth to the public. "We'll need to make this public," the Duke said, his tone thoughtful. "But we must be strategic. A formal gathering, a controlled environment where we can present everything, methodically, calmly, and irrefutably." Catherine nodded. She understood the importance of timing. Too soon, and it would appear like a desperate attack. Too late, and Vivian's lies might solidify in the public's mind. The Duke's plan was simple yet effective. A ball. Not just any ball, but one that would be attended by the most influential figures in London. Lady Pemberton's ball was where the accusations were made. The Duke continued. "We'll host a gathering that matches it. An event where the truth can be laid out in front of the same crowd who once believed the lies." Catherine's mind raced as she considered the implications. This would not be a simple revelation. They would have to expose everything. Vivian's betrayal, Philip's role in it, and the lengths they had gone to ruin her. The idea of facing London's elite again, this time as the woman who had survived their worst, was terrifying, but Catherine knew it was the only way. "We'll make sure the evidence is undeniable," the Duke said, his voice firm. "The forger's testimony, the letters, the payments, the maid's confession, it will all be presented publicly. Everyone will know the truth." Catherine could feel the weight of what was to come, but she stood straighter, a sense of determination flooding her. This was her moment. She wasn't just fighting for her name. She was fighting for justice, for the truth, and for herself. She would face them all, and this time they would see her strength, not her shame. "We do it tomorrow," Catherine said, her voice resolute. "Let's finish this." Later that evening, as the final details of their plan were being discussed, Catherine found herself alone with the Duke. The room was quiet, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. For the first time in days, Catherine allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but she had made it this far. "I couldn't have done this without you," Catherine said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke looked at her, his gray eyes intense, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. "You didn't need me," he replied quietly. "You've always had the strength to fight for yourself." There was a pause, and then, without thinking, Catherine found herself speaking the words that had been swirling in her heart. "When I saw you that night in the rain," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I knew I was meant to fight, but I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I don't think I've ever had someone believe in me the way you do." The Duke's eyes softened, and his hand moved to gently take hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the word hung between them. Unspoken but understood. He didn't say it aloud, but his eyes told her everything. "Because when I saw you in the rain," Alexander continued, his voice rough with emotion, "walking away with such dignity despite your destruction, I didn't just see someone who needed help. I saw the woman I'd been waiting for my entire life. I saw courage I'd only found in myself after years of exile. I saw you, Catherine, and I couldn't let you walk alone. Catherine's breath caught. Alexander, I'm falling in love with you, he whispered. Perhaps I already have. The days leading up to the planned public revelation were filled with a quiet, tense anticipation. Every moment seemed to stretch longer as Catherine waited for the day that would either restore her name or destroy her completely. The invitation for formal ball had gone out, and soon the whispers began to circulate. Society was buzzing with speculation, some curious about her sudden return to London's high society, others eager to see how the fallen lady would present herself. The Duke had arranged everything with meticulous care, ensuring that no one would be able to question the veracity of the evidence once it was presented. As the day of the event drew closer, Catherine found herself preparing in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the gowns or the social intricacies that demanded her attention, but the deepening weight of what was about to happen. Lady Pemberton's ball had been the place where the lies about her had been spread. Now, a different gathering would take its place. And it would be here, in front of the same social circle that had condemned her, that the truth would be revealed. There was no turning back. The Duke was calm and focused, as always, but Catherine could see the subtle tension in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes lingered on the details of their plan. The stakes were high, and they both knew it. The guest list of the event was carefully curated, designed to ensure that the key players would be present, those who would witness her downfall, and those who had a hand in it. Even the location was symbolic, a grand manor, as elegant as it was public, where all eyes would be forced to focus on the events unfolding within. Catherine herself had chosen to wear a gown of midnight blue silk, deep regal, and fitting for a moment that would change her life. She would not be meek or quiet. She would stand tall, her heart pounding not with fear, but with the certainty that this was her moment. She had nothing left to lose but her dignity, and she would reclaim that with everything she had. The evening of the ball arrived, and as Catherine entered the grand ballroom, she could feel every eye on her. The moment she stepped through the door, the room fell silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and all heads turned to watch her. She could feel the heat of their stares, the judgment, the curiosity, but she held her head high, her posture unbroken. She was no longer the woman who had walked out of the engagement ball in disgrace. She was no longer the victim of lies. She was here to reclaim her life. The Duke stood by her side, his presence a quiet strength that seemed to steady her in the midst of the storm. There was no one here who could touch her now. She had prepared for this moment. As they moved into the center of the room, the Duke called for silence. His voice, though quiet, carried across the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather tonight to address a grave injustice," he said, his words cutting to the tension like a blade. What Lady Catherine Ashford has suffered is not merely a matter of public shame. It is a deliberate campaign of lies and deceit that has been allowed to stand unchallenged for too long. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through the room as the Duke turned toward Catherine. "Tonight we will show you the truth." The first piece of evidence was laid out, a set of letters, forged with precision, the ones that had been used to destroy Catherine's reputation. The room grew still as the forger's testimony was presented, his words confirming what everyone had already feared, that the accusations against her had been carefully crafted, that the letters had been falsified with the sole purpose of ruining her. One by one, the pieces fell into place. The maid who had testified against her, bribed and coerced, was exposed. Her testimony was shown to be false, and the truth was undeniable. The crowd began to shift, some faces showing disbelief, others guilt. There was a ripple of recognition as the names of the key conspirators, Philip and Vivian, were brought to the forefront. The financial records were presented next, confirming the payments to the forger, to the maid, to anyone who had been part of the scheme. The evidence was undeniable, irrefutable. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. As Catherine watched the reactions around her, she realized that she had achieved something far more significant than just clearing her name. She had exposed the rot at the heart of society that had once accepted her, and now it could never go back to the way it had been. She could feel the power in the room shift as Vivian Blackwood stood to protest, her face a mask of barely contained fury. But before she could utter a word, the Duke cut her off, his voice cold and commanding. "Your lies would not go unpunished, Miss Blackwood. You have ruined a woman's life to further your own ambitions. And now the truth will be known." The gasps in the room were audible as Vivian's face drained of color. The once proud woman, who had manipulated and schemed her way to the top, was now exposed to the fraud she truly was. Philip Hartley, too, attempted to speak, but his words faltered. He tried to justify his actions, but no one was listening anymore. His debts, his desperation, were laid bare. His role in the scheme, his cold manipulation of Catherine, was clear for all to see. It wasn't long before both Vivian and Philip, unable to withstand the weight of their public shame, fled the ballroom. The room remained eerily quiet for a moment before the whispers began. But this time they were different, reactions of disbelief, of shock, but also of awe. Catherine had done it. She had faced the public judgment, exposed the truth, and come out victorious. The aftermath was quick and devastating for Vivian and Philip. The Duke's calculated strategy had worked, and the fallout from the evening's revelations was swift. Vivian was ostracized, her reputation in tatters as she tried to salvage what was left of her social standing. The whispers that had once been filled with admiration for her beauty and wealth now turned to contempt. She had been stripped of everything she had worked so hard to manipulate into her favor. Philip, too, faced the consequences of his actions. His debts were called in, his reputation ruined beyond repair. His name, one sought after for his title, was now a shadow of its former self, and he was forced into exile to escape the wrath of his creditors. But it wasn't just the damage to their reputations that stung. It was the realization that they had been outmaneuvered, exposed by the very woman they had sought to destroy. As the guests began to file out of the ballroom, Catherine stood by the Duke, her heart racing but her composure intact. The truth had been revealed. Her name was restored. And yet, as she looked around, she realized that what had been lost could never truly be regained. The life she had known before the engagement ball was gone, and though she had won back her dignity, everything else had changed. But perhaps that was the way it was meant to be. She was no longer the same woman. She had been tested, broken, and rebuilt. And now, as the last of the guests departed, Catherine stood tall, a woman who had fought for everything she had lost and come out stronger for it. As the last guest departed, whispering about the most dramatic ball in decades, Catherine stood in the empty ballroom beside Alexander. "It's over," she said softly. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "No," he replied, his gray eyes intense. "It's just beginning. Catherine, I need to ask you something. Come with me." The grand, moonlit hallway of Thornwick House felt like a different world that evening. The revelatory chaos of the ball was behind them. The storm of scandal and confrontation now settled into a fragile peace. Catherine stood at the far end of the hallway, gazing out the window at the rain-soaked streets of London, her thoughts still swirling from the whirlwind events. But there was one thing that had been on her mind since the moment the truth had come to light, since the day she had finally felt the weight of everything she had endured fall away. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she had entered this house, broken and humiliated. The life that had once seemed so certain had been shattered and remade, and now, standing at the precipice of her future, she was no longer afraid. As she turned toward the door, she saw him, the Duke, Alexander, his presence as commanding as ever, though now his gaze was softer, more vulnerable. He stepped into the room, his usual confidence tempered with an air of uncertainty that Catherine had never seen before. His eyes met hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The weight of their shared journey hung in the air. She had seen him change, too. This man who had once been in exile, distant and cold, now standing before her, with a heart laid bare. Catherine felt the tension between them shift, a recognition passing between them that neither of them could deny. "Catherine," the Duke began, his voice surprisingly steady, "I stopped my carriage that night for many reasons, compassion, justice, and because I recognized in you something I hadn't seen in anyone before. But most of all, I stopped because I knew in that moment that you were someone I could not leave behind." His words took her by surprise, and for the briefest of moments, Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected him to say this, to reveal the depths of his feelings. His confession wasn't a grand declaration of love, but it was enough, more than enough to fill the space between them with a tenderness that was both overwhelming and intimate. Alexander took another step toward her, his gaze intense. And in that moment, Catherine knew, without a doubt, that she had found someone who had seen her for who she truly was, someone who had stood beside her through the darkest days and had never once asked her to hide. As he knelt before her, Catherine's heart raced, her breath shallow with the weight of what was happening. "I'm not asking you to marry a duke," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm asking you to marry the man who couldn't let you walk alone, because I saw in you something that made me realize that I've been waiting for someone like you my entire life." He pulled from his pocket a ring, a simple but elegant sapphire surrounded by diamonds, a family heirloom. But it wasn't a ring that caught Catherine's attention. It was a raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes, a vulnerability she had never expected to see in someone so strong, so reserved. The man who had once been a stranger now stood before her, offering her not just a title or a life of security, but the chance to stand by his side as an equal, as a partner. "Marry me, Catherine," he said, his voice breaking slightly as he gazed up at her. "Not from gratitude, but because I cannot imagine a future without you in it. I want us to be partners in everything, in justice, in intellect, in everything that matters." Catherine's mind was reeling as she took in his words, her heart racing with a mixture of disbelief and joy. She had never once imagined that this moment, this life, this love, was possible after everything she had endured. But here he was, offering her a future that was not defined by the past, but by what they could build together. She looked down at him, at the man who had seen her through her darkest moments, and without a second thought, she knew her answer. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I will marry you, Alexander. Not because you saved me, but because you've made me feel like I can finally be myself again." As she knelt beside him, her hand trembling slightly as she took the ring from his hand, their lips met in a kiss that was full of promise, full of the future they would now share. In that moment, all the pain, the fear, and the heartbreak of the past seemed to fade away. All that remained was the certainty of what lay ahead. A life they would build together, not as two people who had been defined by their past, but as two people who had fought for a future worth living. The ceremony was small, intimate, a stark contrast to the grand balls and public spectacles that had once dominated Catherine's life. Catherine stood in Westminster, her gown of soft cream silk that shimmered under the muted light of the cathedral. Her father, still estranged, had not come, nor had any of the friends who had once surrounded her in the glittering halls of high society. But it didn't matter. The people who mattered, the ones who had supported her through her darkest days, were here. The Dowager Duchess Eleanor, who had quietly guided her through this transformation, stood proudly beside her. Margaret Hartley, whose courage had brought the truth to light, was there as well, having found her own redemption. It was not a day of grand celebration, but one of quiet joy, the kind that came from standing beside the one person who had never given up on her, even when the world had turned its back. Alexander, dressed in his formal attire, looked at her with a tenderness she had never seen before. His eyes, usually so guarded, now reflected nothing but love and warmth as he took her hand. The vows they exchanged were simple, but the words held the weight of everything they had been through. "I choose you," Catherine said, her voice steady. "I choose you every day, freely and without hesitation." Alexander's voice was soft but firm as he spoke his vows. "I vow to always see you, to always choose you, and to always walk beside you. In every storm, I will be your shelter. In every triumph, I will be your equal." The moment they sealed their vows with a kiss, Catherine knew, without a doubt, that her life had come full circle. She had started this journey alone, but now she was standing beside someone who truly understood her, someone who saw her for who she was, not for scandal or the shame, but for the strength, intelligence, and courage that defined her. Their future, together, stretched out before them. A year later, Catherine stood on the cliffs of the Cornwall estate, the wind tugging at her hair as she looked out over the turbulent sea below. The estate was far removed from the society she had once known, and yet it had become a home filled with warmth and purpose. As the Duchess of Thornwick, Catherine had become a force in her own right, actively involved in reforms that protected women's reputations and provided sanctuary for those who had been wronged, just as she had once been. She held regular salons for women who had faced scandal, offering them the same refuge she had found in Thornwick House. Alexander, now her husband, stood beside her, his hand in hers, just as it had always been. Together, they had rebuilt not only her life, but their shared future. The whispers of society had quieted over time. Those who had once judged her now acknowledged her strength. Philip Hartley, still living in exile, had been left to deal with his debts, while Vivian had married a wealthy but elderly baron and lived in unhappy seclusion. Margaret Hartley had found happiness with a kind and gentle man, her own future now free from the shadow of her family's manipulation. Catherine had come full circle, from the woman who had been cast aside to the woman who had claimed her rightful place in the world. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances, but a woman who had reclaimed her life, her voice, and her future. As she turned to Alexander, her heart full of contentment, she knew that the journey they had begun together was just the beginning. Together, they had found not only justice, but love, true, unwavering love that had transformed them both. As Catherine walked along the cliff path, her hand resting lightly in Alexander's, she spotted a young woman sitting alone, her face hidden in her hands as she cried. Catherine's heart ached as she approached the girl, sitting beside her without hesitation. "Are you all right?" Catherine asked gently. The girl looked up, her eyes filled with confusion and pain. I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I've lost everything, my family, my reputation." Catherine nodded, her own past echoing in the girl's words. "I know exactly how you feel," she said softly, "but you don't have to go through this alone." Offering the girl her hand, Catherine helped her to her feet. "Come with me. You don't have to be alone." As they made their way back toward Thornwick House, Alexander met them halfway. Understanding immediately what had happened, he offered a comforting smile to the girl, and as Catherine watched them walk back together, she knew that her journey had come full circle. She had been the one helped, the one who had been offered a second chance. And now, she was the one offering the same. "Why would you help me?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. Catherine smiled warmly. "Because someone stopped their carriage for me," she said, her voice steady. "Because silence doesn't mean guilt. Because sometimes the worst thing that happens is actually the door opening to your best life." As they walked together, Catherine looked back at the cliffs, the place where her own journey had begun. She had walked away from destruction. Now, she was walking towards something far greater, her purpose, her strength, her future. The silence of the past was finally broken. As they reached the manor, Catherine glanced back one last time at the cliff path she had walked so long ago. Strong, happy, and free, she had walked away from the destruction. Now, she walked toward others who still walked alone, offering the same choice she had been given. Not rescue, but partnership. Not salvation, but the chance to save themselves. The carriage had stopped for her. Now, she stopped for others. And in that circle of grace, she had found everything she never knew she needed: voice, strength, love, and purpose. The silence, finally and forever, broken. Thank you for journeying with Catherine from her darkest moment to her greatest triumph. Sometimes walking away is the first step toward everything you deserve. What moved you most? The carriage stopping? The public vindication? The love that grew from mutual respect? Share your thoughts below. If this story touched your heart, please share, and help us reach others who need to remember that destruction can be transformation's beginning. Subscribe for more stories of silent strength becoming powerful voices, of broken engagements becoming true love, of women who refuse to stay victims. Your support means everything. Another tale of justice and unexpected love awaits you next.